Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on the time into this lecture. This is Dr. Emily Hager Casey Camp, and today we are talking about the British colonization in the Chesapeake region. So we're talking about the initial stages of British colonization. And obviously, this is important from where we're talking about with the strong legacy that British colonialism has in our culture today, in our society today. And it really is kind of the root of, with obviously lots of other influences, but it is British common law, British culture is going to be really important into how the United States develops and how we get to where we are today. So, when we're looking at the chapter questions for this lecture, one of the first ones we're looking at is an English colony on the Chesapeake Bay. That's the first section. Explain why England decided to establish colonies in the New World and what challenges the early colonists faced. So, when we're talking about this, why the British were motivated to create settlement colonies in America, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, okay, well, what is Britain? What does it mean to be British? And as with any of these videos that I have posted, I link them in the lectures. And then I also post them online in the modules so you can kind of pause here. If we were doing this in class, in a classroom setting, I would pause here and we would watch the video. So if you want to go ahead and pause this video here right off the bat, we are going to be going over what the British, what it does mean to be British. Now, the British live on islands, the British Isles. As if you watch the video and you're coming back to us, the British live on islands. There is limited room for growth, limited room for more agriculture or a growing population. So they do have a growing population. They need more room. The cities are becoming very overcrowded, and there's lots of other reasons why the people in Britain want to move. The enclosure movement being one of them. The enclosure movement is a series of events that started to take place in Great Britain where the landowners stopped farming and started raising sheep. And to do raise the sheep, you need like a couple of shepherds. You don't need a whole lot of farmers to farm the land. So all of a sudden, the land that had been farmed was no longer being farmed, and there was nowhere for the farmers to go. So that's one of the reasons they would leave Britain. There was also a series of laws that were being passed, the Statute of Artificers, that was increasing the power of the government. And that power of the government could seem and was, in some instances, very oppressive. Now, there was also poor laws that limited what people could do if they had a certain amount of debt. So that was another reason why people would leave. These poor laws made living undesirable there. Now, there was also a desire for self rule for various groups. If you were religious or political dissenter, there was a desire for you to have some control over your own land because the power of the state, the power of the crown was very strong in Great Britain. Now, there's also this massive desire for land and for resources. Actual land to farm was limited. They also needed food sources, they needed resources. One of the things that you'll read about, even in like old school tales about like Robin Hood or anything kind of taking place in England in the 1300s, is that they were hunting and they would be in trouble for crossing on the king's land, or if they cut down a tree that was the king's tree, it was a big deal, and people would get thrown in prison. And one of the reasons why that was such a big deal is because there was very limited amount of resources. There wasn't a lot of wood to go around. They had been using it. There wasn't this endless supply. Now, also, as I kind of indicated with that desire for self rule, there is this desire for religious freedom slash toleration. Now, most of the time, they did not move to be tolerant. They moved to have their freedom to practice their religion as they wanted. Now, in the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland is going to be created as a haven for Catholics later on. The Pennsylvania will be founded as a haven for Quakers. But one of the things that we do have to remember, Maryland is actually the first colony to have a religious toleration act. But most of the time, when we think about the Puritans or the Pilgrims coming over here for religious freedom, in actuality, in their own societies, there was not religious freedom or toleration. You had to do what they said in the society. And that's actually how we get a lot of these small New England colonies, is the fact that they are splintering off from one another. And um, if you don't believe in their religion, you have to move out. That's essentially how it goes. Now, there's also the idea of representative rule coming out of Parliament, and that again goes with that desire for self rule that we see coming out of the British Isles. Now, this is why this is why people, average, ordinary people, wanted why they were motivated to settle colonies in America. Now, the crown had other reasons to allow that colonization, and that reason would be mercantilism. Mercantilism is a theory, it is a economic theory, a political theory that controls much of the economic thought and actions during much of the colonial period, and even on and through the 1900s, really. This is one of the reasons that monarchies, the British monarchy included, wanted to expand, because the idea was that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world. There is a zero sum game. This means if I said there's 100 points available in the class for the whole class and everybody has to fight. So if you get 10, that's 10 points that someone else can't get. There's a limited amount of money or points that you can win. So it's a zero sum game. And obviously, that is not how we want economic growth. That's not the same thing that we have today. We don't have this idea that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world. But the idea that there is a zero sum game and that you wanted to get that for yourself meant that you were in competition with the rest of the countries in the world, and you wanted to get that for yourself. So most people during this period believed that the way to gain was to take from others or to make sure that others did not benefit from you. There was also this idea within mercantilism that existing wealth had to be secured by work, and that empires could take advantage of this and exploit wealth, work, resources through colonies, royal charters, trade regulations, and monopolies. So here we have in this image the mother country benefiting from the colonies, bringing them gold, silver, foodstuff, raw materials. Now, as we move on, mercantilism, what does this mean for the American colonies? That they existed for the good of the mother country. In the case that we're talking about today, we're talking about the British colonies and the British crown or the English crown. And they are required, the British colonies are required to export their raw materials to Britain. They are not allowed to sell them to the highest bidder. If American goods are going to end up somewhere in Europe, they have to be sold through Britain. So Britain still gets to tax, they get to control, and it's British bankers and investors and the British crown who are getting that money. So this also means they have to buy most of their finished goods from England. And even if they buy, you know, something from France, say they're going to get French silk, that they have to get it from a British seller. So that means it's going to be a higher markup, so they pay more money for it. Now, basically, all of this creates an economic imbalance, a power imbalance, with the colonies getting the fuzzy end of the lollipop, getting on the low end of the stick. It's not a reciprocal relationship, although there are benefits to being a colony. You can get the protection from the British Navy if you're participating in that trade. So there are some things that kind of are you have a guaranteed market for your goods and you're going to get the protection, but it's also a pretty raw deal. Now, one of the things when we're talking about colonization, the first place that's going to be colonized is the Jamestown settlement. Now, although, and it's very a fragile settlement, as if you're familiar at all with American history, this is something that oftentimes gets discussed, and you'll hear a lot about it. Now, although Spain is claiming all of North America under the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, King James believed that England could come in on the outskirts of Spain's New World Empire. And this is happening at a time when Spain is completely dominant. So when they talk about being afraid of Spanish pirates or of Spanish navy, they have rightful reason to be afraid. So 144 Englishmen are going to form a joint stock company, and they are going to arrive at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay April 26th, 1607. So if you're thinking that Columbus has been there 1492, this is over 100 years later. So they've been dominating the game for Spain has been dominating the game for 100 years. Now, the settlers are going to come there, and they are really unprepared to do any of the work required for colonization. They were looking at that Spanish example and saying, like, oh, we're going to arrive. There's going to be a labor force. It was a bunch of second sons, a bunch of nobility. They brought a goldsmith with them because they thought there was going to be a lot of gold to work with. They didn't bring any farmers. They didn't bring any tradesmen. They didn't bring anybody who knew how to do anything. So they're pretty bad off. But they're going to build a fort on a peninsula in a territory that's ruled by an Indian headman, Powhatan. Now, this is demonstrating the fact they built their fort on this small peninsula, kind of defended, it's covered, surrounded by three sides by water, so they're kind of protected. Basically saying that they know, they are aware that they need to protect themselves from the Native Americans and the Spanish. They also are going to face additional threats from disease and starvation, and that is going to be one of the things that's going to kill off a lot of their population. Also, the fact is that once people get sick and die, one of the things they have discovered through archaeology in the Jamestown settlement was that they were not burying the bodies deep enough in the soil so that the disease and the rotting bodies were going back into their well water, into their drinking water. So that was pretty brutal. Now, the Algonquin people, Powhatans that live in the area, are actually going to rescue these weak and demoralized English colonists by offering them corn for trade. And despite the fact that the Virginia Company had promised that the settlers who came over, that the investors would become rich, most colonists do not survive. It's a very high mortality rate here. But one of the things that's going to happen is that there is going to be a culture clash. Now, even though we see cultures clashing, that doesn't mean that military fighting was inevitable. There is some cooperation and a lot of trade that goes on in the early years. Now, Powhatan's people are going to stay in contact with the British, with the people at Jamestown, but they are also going to maintain a healthy distance from the English settlers, and the colonists are going to use violence, and that is going to compel the Algonquins to regard the English with a bit of suspicion, and rightfully so. Now, although the Native Americans are going to retaliate against the English, they don't organize an all out assault against the intruders. If they had wanted to push them into the sea, they absolutely could have. But they don't. They want them to stop fighting. They want them to um, stop attacking them. But they're really, really valuing English goods that they're obtaining through trade. So they don't just kill them all. They don't just go on to a full frontal war. They don't just make them leave. They want to trade with them. So also they basically conclude that the English are going to make better allies than their enemies. Now, despite continued trade with Powhatan and his people, the Powhatan Indians, the English colonists, as I said, are primarily gentlemen and a few of their servants. They know nothing about farming, so they are very, very much unable to provide food for themselves for more than a decade. So they're going to continue for 10 years to rely on the Indians for food. So after Powhatan, this is going to be an arrangement that's going to work pretty well for the Powhatans and for the English since they're, staying alive. But after Powhatan dies in 1618, his brother, Opechancanough, and that's the name right there if you're wondering how to spell it, he is going to take over as the head man, as the supreme chief. And he has a bit of a bad history with the English, including John Smith, who's oftentimes seen as the hero of Jamestown. He was a military man, he was more experienced. was an adventurer. He knew how to rough it, and he, instituted some pretty strict rules that were going to keep the Virginia colony anywhere alive, essentially. But he had made some bad enemy of Opechancanough, and in 1622, that's going to come back and haunt the English because Opechancanough is going to launch a full-out assault on the English settlers, and then that is going to compel the colonists and the Algonquins to regard each other as perpetual enemies. Now, this uprising that's going to be by Opechancanough and the Powhatans and the Algonquins that are living surrounding that area is going to be so damaging to the colony, so damaging to the colonists that it prompts a royal investigation. Like, what the heck is going on in Virginia? It's crazy. You guys are getting what's going on here. So, this going to, when the crown and these people in England start to look a bit more into what's going on, they basically see that there's an appalling mortality rate, and that's being caused by disease and mismanagement more so than it actually is by Indian raids. So the king is going to revoke the Virginia Company's charter in 1622 and appoint a royal governor. But many of the features that were established under the Virginia Company, including the House of Burgesses, which is going to be the first representative government in America, and that's kind of an important fact, are going to remain intact. But this demise of the Virginia Company, even though it's going to leave a strong legacy, a strong independent legacy, is going to mark the end of the first phase of Chesapeake colonization. And you can see here, they're going to actually expand through the region pretty quickly. If you look what was settled by 1650, in only 50 short years, they're going to expand to much of what we call the Tidewater region. And you can see here a lot of fame: Richmond, Williamsburg, Yorktown, Norfolk. Norfolk, excuse me, Annapolis, St. Mary's, and they're going to be part of the Maryland colony, but they're all going to be formed very quickly. And one of the reasons that this is going to be able to happen is because of the method that the Virginians used to plan their settlements. They are going to use the idea of hundreds. Basically, is what they call their settlements. Settlements of around 100 families. And every time you establish a new settlement, they can send a representative to the House of Burgesses, which, as I said in the last slide, is that first representative government in British North America. Now, that eventually will become the lower house of the government. The Virginia Company does appoint a governor, and then the governor appoints a council, which is the upper house of the government. Now, as I said, the Virginia Company has lost a lot of control over the colony. It's a very wild place. There's no religion, there's no moral code, there's no churches, there's no family life that's going to provide any type of stability. And that's when they, in 1624, they make the transition over to a royal colony. But the idea of the House of Burgesses, of the council, of the governor, of that representative rule is still going to be in place. Now, the king is going to attempt to get rid of this self-governing aspect of the colony, but he cannot put cannot put that back in the box, and he eventually is going to be forced to begrudgingly accept that style of government coming from Virginia. Now, when we look at the next chapter question, we're looking at the development of what's happening in the South, and really looking at their transition to becoming a tobacco society, and really recognizing how the introduction of tobacco is going to reshape the Chesapeake region and the Virginia colony. And not just Virginia, though. Maryland is going to be heavily influenced by this as well, and that's one of the things that's going to have this legacy that's eventually going to result in slavery as we get to the end of this lecture. I also want to point out, I'm not sure if you can hear that. That's background noise over there. My children are at home. I'm recording this at home, so I do apologize for any background noise that you're hearing. Trying to record with cartoons in the background. Hopefully you can't hear it too much. It's not too distracting. So as we get into talking about a tobacco society and what exactly does that mean? Well, tobacco is going to be found out pretty early. It's actually one of the original settlers with the Virginia colony that basically they're trying to figure out, okay, there's no gold here. How are we going to get rich? They come up with the cash crop, and tobacco is what they've got. And you can see here there's some things showing us a bit about cutting tobacco, what it looked like, what the tobacco system was here. But tobacco is a very fussy plant. It requires a lot of detail, detailed attention. It requires a lot of labor. And it doesn't just go seasonally. It's not like it only grows in the summer and you have the rest of the winter to take off. It requires hand year-round labor by hand. You have to plant the crop, then you have to go and trim off the top leaves. It's very fussy and very particular. You have to tend to it constantly. Once then it's ready for harvest, you have to harvest it, which is a lot of work. Then you have to dry it and put it in these. And then once you dry it, you have to pack it in the barrels and then prepare it for shipment. So it's a very labor intensive plant. It requires a large labor force to work pretty constantly. Now, and obviously they only have primitive tools, and this is going to make this a very intensive cycle of labor, very taxing. Now, the English colonists are working hard because their labor promises a greater reward in the Chesapeake region than it did in England. So they are very happy to be there. The land in Virginia was very abundant, it was very cheap. So settlement is encouraged by the policy that settlers who paid for their transportation to the Chesapeake in order to get more population live there to grow the citizenry are going to receive 50 acres of free land. So if you get there and you've paid your own way, you can receive 50 acres of free land, and this is called a head right. And this method of giving away land is called a head right system. However, as I said, it does create a servant labor system because one person cannot possibly grow tobacco by themselves. So there is this powerful incentive to go to the Chesapeake, and it's also combined with the desperate need of the colonists for labor. And about 80% of the immigrants to the Chesapeake during the 17th century, meaning in the 1600s, are going to be indentured servants. They are people who are very poor, living in England, that are going to basically say, okay, if you pay my way to America, I will work for you for 7 years. And oftentimes it ends up scamming the indentured servants because once you're there as an indentured servant, if you get sick and they have to pay for a doctor to come look at you, they might add another year to your service. Oftentimes, women who were indentured servants were raped, and then they were or had or weren't raped and had consensual sex, and with the people who technically owned their labor, owned their contract, and then they would be like, "Well, now I'm paying for your child's food and your child's boarding, so now you have to work another 2 years." And the mortality rate in Virginia and in the Chesapeake as a whole during this time is such that there's a very strong chance that you will not live to see the end of your contract. So most of the people who are coming are indentured servants. Indentured servants are pretty cheap. They are a cheap labor source. So they are that is what's going to be used in Virginia. Now, the first Africans are going to arrive in Virginia in 1619, and then we have more and more Africans arriving as slaves into the Chesapeake region during the next several decades. Now, most people of African descent were slaves for life. Some do become indentured servants who achieve freedom after serving out their terms or by doing other things that are going to win them their freedom. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the strange system of slavery during the colonial period and during especially in the 1600s that remains in flux. We're going to talk more about that as we move forward here. But as I said, for the indentured servants, which were the main source of labor during this time period we're discussing, they would agree to work anywhere from the indentured servants would agree to work from 4 to 7 years in order to repay their loan, and many of them aren't going to live out that. So it's a very cheap labor source. Now, indentured servants are overwhelmingly male, young, unskilled labor. Women and craftsmen, skilled craftsmen, are going to be very rare in the Chesapeake. Now, there is going to be a lot of rigors of servitude. Um, there is all servants, regardless of well, and here we can, I'll come back to that in a second, but here we see indentured servants and tobacco, indentured servants that sometimes the captains would pay for the indentured servants to come over and basically sell the terms of their indentured at Richmond on Wednesday, the 20th of May, and then they would say, "There, here's some tradesmen." So this is them trying to bring them in to the to the to buy these indentured servants. But when we look at, there's a lot of rigors of indentured servitude. All servants, regardless of gender, race, nationality, had to work and socialize together. So this means that at this point in time, Africans who are coming into the Tidewater Chesapeake region work with the whites. There's not a lot of distinction there. Planters are going to devise very strict, severe laws that are designed to keep these indentured servants in their place and to extend the terms of their indentured, as I said. Now, women servants are subject to special restrictions and risk. They're prohibited from marrying during this time period, and if you did happen to give birth to a child, you had to serve an extra 2 years and additionally pay a fine. Now, there's going to be punishments that are a part of this, and they're going to reflect the fundamental realities of this time period. Planters' hunger for labor caused them to demand as much labor as they could get from their servants. Now, servants are working in the hopes that they are going to survive their servitude, obtain land, and start their own family. And the servants are often going to be made begrudging, half hearted workers because they viewed themselves in this temporary status of servitude. And planters are going to put up with this contentious arrangement because the alternatives were less desirable. You could not easily hire free men and women because the land was abundant, and free people preferred to work land that was their own for themselves. So, um, as we see the settlement growing and more people coming, either as free people but mainly as indentured servants, the vast acres of these wilderness are going to become interrupted by tobacco farms. A settled region is going to be um, spread out, and we see it's going to not go along any what the textbook describes it as a lace work of farms stitched around the waterways, and I think that is such a great way to put it, because you're not transporting tobacco via the road. If you build a plantation house, it faces the river, it faces the stream, not a stream, but anywhere you could move your flat boats with your tobacco on them. Now, most Chesapeake colonists are Protestants, but they are not particularly religious. They don't move there for religious reasons. They move there for economic reasons. So they're not going to be as religious or as religious dominated of society as New England, which we typically think of. Now, Lord Baltimore, when he gets a charter to create a colony for Maryland, is it, as I said, intends it to make it a refuge for Catholics. And however, Catholics are never going to become the majority. The Protestants are going to maintain a majority. So the colony's society, economy, politics, and cultures are going to become very closely aligned with, almost indistinguishable from, Virginia's. Both colonies are going to share this devotion to tobacco and look very similar. And that's what I said earlier about the Maryland creating this religious toleration. The Catholics are the ones who are supposedly in power, and they create laws about religious toleration basically to be self-serving, like, hey, you majority, don't come over here and try to step on our toes because we're the Catholic minority and we want to make sure that our rights are protected. So hopefully, um, this kind of explains and answers these questions about how an English colony on the Chesapeake is going to develop, why it develops there, what challenges the early colonists face. Hopefully, you can answer that question, and as well recognize how the introduction of tobacco into that region is going to shape the Virginia colony. So I know this is a really quick and dirty version of this history. I want to hit the high points and really kind of point out to you, like, hey, this is the kind of stuff we're looking at in this lecture. Hopefully it's making some sense to you. It's helping you understand the textbook, put it in some type of order, let you know what you're looking for. When we come back next time with part two, we will be discussing the hierarchy and inequality in the Chesapeake. If anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns, I would love for you to put them in the comment section down below. As always, this is a closed course. Nobody can see it except for you all in the class. So if you have questions, don't be shy about putting them down there. But if you want to ask me personally, of course, reach out to me in my office hours or via email. I